Scott Ritter, we are at a moment when one mistake could trigger a nuclear war. Published by LZ the 21st of October 2022 by Margaret Flowers. Translation LZ note. This is a transcript of a recent interview with Scott Ritter on Clearing the Fog. Ritter says that NATO military exercises simulating a nuclear attack against Russia, starting this week, could trigger a nuclear war and should be postponed, but there are no adults in the room ready to do so. Ritter also predicts how the proxy war in Ukraine will end, and he offers important advice as we live in the historic era of the decline of the U.S. empire. Transcript.
Hi, I am Margaret Flowers, MF.
Hi, I am Scott Ritter.
You're listening to Clearing the Fog, Telling the Truth to Expose the Forces of Greed with Margaret Flowers. And now I'll move on to my guest, Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former naval intelligence officer who served in the former Soviet Union. He was also the United Nations Chief Inspector in Iraq in the early 1990s and a critic of the U.S. war in Iraq. Now he is speaking out, writing and providing an important analysis of the situation in Ukraine. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me again, Scott. Scott Ritter, SR. Well, thank you very much for having me. The last time we spoke was in April, and at that time Russia referred to the conflict in Ukraine as a special military operation. In light of recent events, including the vote on the accession of the 4 Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson to the Russian Federation, has the character of the conflict changed?
Well, from a legal point of view, Russia continues to call the conflict a special military operation. I've spent a lot of time now talking to Russians, high-ranking Russians at different levels of government, from the military to the intelligence service to the parliament. It has become clear to me that this particular military operation is also an emotional reality that we in the West do not understand. It is not a conflict between enemies, at least not from the Russian perspective. Rather, it is a family conflict, and Russia's action towards Ukraine is not that of a nation trying to destroy another nation in order to subjugate a people. It is a conflict fought with deep sorrow and reluctance, which explains the Russians' hesitancy. And so military analysts like me have been tearing their hair out for 8 months trying to figure out what Russia is actually doing. Why do they do it in this process? As a Marine, I have to tell you that some of the things the Russians have done are just inexplicable, because that's not how you win. The Marines are about winning wars. We focus solely on winning on the battlefield. And I've looked at what the Russians have done, and that is not what I would do. And one of the reasons why you don't get spectacular results is because of what you do. But that is what Russia wanted to do. They were not there to win in the conventional sense of the word. They wanted to achieve a result that did not lead to the death of Ukrainian civilians and the destruction of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Because as many Russians explained to me, you don't destroy your neighborhood if you want to live in that neighborhood. I think Russia has realized that this conflict is no longer a family dispute between Russia and Ukraine, but that the Ukrainian side has basically been taken over by what the Russians call the collective West. NATO. The United States and the European Union have turned this conflict into a proxy conflict, and in order to win it, Russia would have to firstly increase investment. That's why we have the partial mobilization, and secondly, radically change the basic concept of this conflict. It is no longer a conflict fought between Russians and Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil. It is now a conflict fought between Russia and the collective West on Russian soil. This is the consequence of Russia taking sovereignty over these Ukrainian provinces, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. It is now Mother Russia. And that is changing Russia's approach to confronting its enemy. I also think that Russia is slowly realizing that the Zelensky government has turned into a terrorist government. We see it committing acts of terror. The murder of Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin in Moscow, was an act of terror, and ironically the United States almost recognizes this. When the CIA turns to the New York Times and says that this was carried out by Ukrainian intelligence on the orders of President Zelensky, it means, without saying it but legally, that Ukrainian intelligence is now a terrorist organization and the Zelensky government is a state sponsor of terrorism. Even the attack on the Crimean Bridge, the Crimean Bridge is a legitimate military target, and if it was attacked by a bomber, a missile, or a detachment of special forces in Ukrainian uniform, that would be a legitimate act of war. But it is not a legitimate act of war if a civilian driver in a truck with hidden explosives commits suicide to blow up the bridge. So I think that the attack on the bridge was a red line that Russia had warned Ukraine not to cross. It was crossed. I also think that Russia has come to terms with the fact that it is no longer fighting Ukraine on Ukrainian soil. This is now a conflict between Russia and the collective West on Russian soil. You know, the aftermath of the Russian takeover of 4 territories. This is a crucial moment when Russia realizes that it has to turn away from the original concept of a special military operation, a family dispute, and move to the new manifestation of the special military operation, which is an international conflict between Russia and the collective West. It mirrors the strategic air campaign that the West waged against Iraq in 1991. On the first day, we attacked these targets. It took Russia 8 months to get to that point, but now they are. It is a crucial turning point, and the sad thing is that in order to achieve this victory, Russia will now be forced to kill hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, lose thousands of Russian human lives, and destroy the Ukrainian nation. This is a war that need not have been fought and should not have been fought. It could have been avoided if the West had simply preferred diplomacy to confrontation. Russia exhausted all diplomatic means before deciding to go to war, and now the West seems to be blocking every possible diplomatic way out by encouraging Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian.
At the beginning, Russia was very clear that it would not attack a number of cities in Ukraine. It wanted to avoid civilian deaths. However, they hit a communications tower just outside Kiev. Can you tell us what they are targeting now with this new campaign? I heard that the death toll was much higher in shock and awe.
Well, first of all, the Russians are not targeting civilians. I know people say, wait a minute, that was a power plant. A power plant is an important part of the national infrastructure and a legitimate war target. There is no argument that can be made under international humanitarian law or any other law that says this is a war crime. It is a legitimate target of attack because a country's military industry, command and control functions, and communications associated with military activities all require electricity, and that electricity comes from these power generation facilities that were attacked by Russia. But you know, even one civilian death is a tragedy and should be overcome, but given the scope and scale of Russia's attacks on these targets, the Ukrainian civilian death toll is less than 20 at this point. People need to understand that the United States has killed thousands of human beings in similar attacks against Iraq, which were also lawful under the laws of war. Russia is doing everything it can not to harm the civilian population of Ukraine, and is specifically targeting critical infrastructure to minimize civilian casualties.
You talked about the attack on the bridge and the murder being terrorist attacks. I think Biden said at the beginning of the conflict that the U.S. had withdrawn the CIA and troops from Ukraine. But recently, The Intercept reported that U.S. Special Forces are indeed on the ground in Ukraine. Do you have any idea how much coordination there is between U.S. intelligence, the U.S. military, and the Ukrainian military?
Well, I can speculate based on past experience, but I can also quote, for example, the Deputy Director of Ukrainian Intelligence in Kiev, who says that there is a direct link between intelligence fusion cells. A fusion cell is a place where the United States and NATO bring together all the intelligence capabilities, the satellites, the aircraft, the intercepted communications, the human intelligence, and so on, and they come together in a single cell where they combine it into an intelligence product that can be used by the Ukrainians in almost real time. So they collect this data, they analyze this data package, and they send this data directly to Ukraine. And this deputy commander basically said that Ukraine can't do anything without this kind of intelligence support. That is why, for example, Elon Musk's Starlink satellite communication system is so important, because it has enabled Ukraine to receive and use intelligence data in near real time and then communicate with each other in real time. That increases the capability of the Ukrainian military. So we know that there is ongoing intelligence coordination with the Ukrainians. We've also heard from other Ukrainians who talk about specific intelligence support in terms of targeting the artillery systems provided by the United States and NATO, both the towed artillery like the triple howitzer M and the HIMARS system, the high mobility artillery rocket system that Ukraine has received. The United States provides the targeting system and the deployment mechanism. For example, they monitor Russian aircraft and Russian troop movements and find a window of opportunity for the Ukrainians to maneuver their artillery to a specific location to hit a specific target without fear of retaliation. So that is the level of support that is taking place, but that can be done from afar and has been done from afar. U.S. forces are needed in the covert movement of tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment from NATO countries to Ukraine. And this is where the special forces come in. They set up networks of intermediate hideouts, covert camps, we call them secure camps, that change daily. The location of these camps and the timing of movements between the camps are closely coordinated with the intelligence services that monitor Russian intelligence. When a Russian satellite flies by, when a Russian surveillance plane is in the air, when a Russian drone is in the air, things of that nature, and we, the West, identify gaps in Russian coverage, and then we set up a line of communication that bypasses those gaps and gets that equipment from the border to the front. A lot of people are asking, why is Russia allowing this to happen? How could this happen? Why doesn't Russia blow this stuff up at the border? Why is this stuff coming to the front? It's getting to the front because we have dozens, if not hundreds, of American special forces, covert warriors, who are monitoring this and setting it up. They're not on the front lines, they're not fighting, but they're the ones who make it possible for the front lines to exist the way they do today. And that's what they're doing.
You recently published an article in Consortium News called Pipelines versus USA, in which you wrote about the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. You said that beyond a reasonable doubt, it looks like the United States was behind it. Can you say something about these attacks on the pipelines?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what the pipeline is. It is an important part of the energy infrastructure, not only for Germany and Russia, but for the whole of Europe. The Nord Stream 1 pipeline transported 55 billion cubic meters of gas, and if the Nord Stream 2 pipeline had come on stream, it would have transported another 55 billion cubic meters of gas. That is enough gas to supply not only Germany but most of Europe with cheap, clean Russian gas that makes the European economy work, makes it efficient, and since Europeans don't pay a market price for their gas, provides Europe with the kind of household luxury that gives them free healthcare, free education, good labor standards, a high quality of life, and a nice infrastructure. That is what Russia's gas provides. The problem with Russian gas is that it keeps American gas out of the market. America produces a lot of gas, but we don't have a pipeline connecting the United States to Europe. We ship it as liquefied natural gas, which is a very different transport configuration. You need special ships and special port facilities. You need special tanks, and Europe would have to invest many billions of dollars to get American gas. And indeed, there was a push to do that, but even then the U.S. could never match Russian gas. But the United States has had a problem with Europe's dependence on Russian gas for some time. We wrongly believed that Russia would weaponize gas. Russia is an energy supplier. That is its business model. If your business model is to supply energy, you lose your credibility as a reliable energy supplier the moment you weaponize the gas. The fastest way for Russia to lose the European market would be to arm itself with gas. Russia did not cause the current situation where there is no Russian gas flowing to Europe. The United States and Europe brought about this situation by sanctioning Russian gas. The byproduct of the sanctions against Russian gas is that the gas is no longer flowing to Germany to the same extent. Germany is paying a high price at the moment. It's literally going into the cold months now. There were demonstrations in the streets as Germans realized that this policy would not only leave them cold and hungry in the winter, but would also leave them unemployed and jobless. Their factories would be closed. They would lose their jobs, so they started demonstrating in the streets, demanding that the German government start up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, repair the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and get the gas flowing. Now Germany's hands were tied because the government had bought into the European Union sanctions. But pressure was applied, and any politician faced with the imminent threat of defeat at the polls suddenly wakes up and is suddenly willing to do things they were unwilling to do a week ago. And the fear of the United States is that the Germans, realizing that they are losing the confidence of the German people, might in fact start turning off Russian gas. So all of a sudden the pipeline went down. Why am I saying that the United States did this? Here in the United States, the prisons are full of human beings serving very long sentences who have been convicted on purely circumstantial evidence. The circumstantial evidence that America attacked the pipelines is stronger than that used to convict many of these human beings. There are three things to consider when building a circumstantial case. The first is intent. We have an admission by Joe Biden, a clear statement of intent, in which he says on the 7th of February, when the Russian tanks cross the border into Ukraine, I will shut down Nord Stream 2. It will stop working. And when a journalist said, wait a minute, this is a German piece of infrastructure. How can you do that? He said, we will do it. So that's it. That is a confession before the fact. That is the clear statement of intent. Now we come to motive. One of the questions a prosecutor asks is cui bono? Who benefits from this? This is where Anthony Blinken, the foreign minister, comes in. Instead of consoling his European allies, his close German friends, America's partners, about this terrible loss of $12 billion worth of critical infrastructure that will plunge Europe into the Stone Age this winter, Blinken says this is a great opportunity because it allows the United States to import its gas at 10 times the market price. So we are making whopping profits while displacing cheap Russian gas. That is the clearest explanation of motive that you can have. And then we have the means. The United States, of course, is holding a naval exercise over the place where the bombs exploded that blew up the pipeline, and we know there were bombs. The Swedes have investigated. Everybody investigated and said, no, they were definitely explosions. And what did we train in? Unmanned underwater vehicles, especially one called Sea Fox. Why am I mentioning the Sea Fox? Well, in 2015, a Sea Fox was found under the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So clearly we have deployed the Sea Fox. It blows a hole in the pipeline. We trained on the Sea Fox in June. And in September we had aircraft that can deploy Sea Fox flying directly over the pipeline on 25 and the 26th of September, the days of the attack. So we have the means. I could take all three of those things, go to a court of law and convict the United States beyond a reasonable doubt of the crime against that pipeline.
It is just inconceivable to me that the United States would do such a thing. It is an attack on infrastructure outside Ukraine. The message to the EU is that the US is ready to do anything in this conflict, and to this end, NATO military exercises are to start on the 17th of October. What do you think about these exercises? What are the risks involved?
Well, these are not just exercises. These are NATO nuclear deterrence exercises. It is an exercise where NATO will simulate the use of a B-61 nuclear bomb with aircraft that are classified as nuclear capable. The B-61 is an American nuclear weapon that we store in various places in Europe, and which will be handed over to various NATO countries whose aircraft can handle it. Its pilots are trained for only one purpose: dropping nuclear bombs on the Russians, and that's it. There is no other reason for them to exist. So we will conduct a nuclear exercise with nuclear-capable aircraft and simulate a nuclear attack on Russia. Under normal circumstances, it would be insane to do something like that because it sends a completely wrong signal. But a week ago, the Ukrainian president implored NATO to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. When Russia started sending cruise missiles against Ukrainian infrastructure targets, a panicked Zelensky made his broadcast, imploring NATO to launch a preemptive strike against Russia, a nuclear strike. That in itself is a visual problem. So the Ukrainian president, an ally of the West, supported by the West, is asking for a preemptive nuclear strike against the Russians. And now NATO is conducting an exercise preparing for a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. I mean, what is the other purpose of this exercise? So optics alone dictate that mature people in NATO stop this exercise and say this is not a good time for this exercise. We don't want there to be any misunderstanding. And this potential is not only in theory. You only have to remember 1983. There was a similar NATO exercise called Able Archer 83, where after American troops moved into Europe as part of the Reforger exercise, the return of forces to Germany, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops were flown in, assembled with prepared equipment to be ready against a Soviet attack. We then said that we would exercise NATO's ability to use nuclear weapons. The Soviets observed this and interpreted it to mean that NATO already has all the troops it needs, and that it will now launch a preemptive nuclear strike against us and use those troops to attack us. So Russia has raised its nuclear readiness to the highest level and has put its nuclear forces on standby. A single mistake, a single misunderstanding could have led to a nuclear holocaust destroying the whole world. Able Archer 83 was that dangerous. It was so bad that Ronald Reagan, Mr. Evil Empire, when he was briefed on it by the CIA a year later, said, "Wait a minute. The Soviets actually thought we were going to launch a preemptive nuclear strike, and the CIA said yes, they thought that was the case." Ronald Reagan said that was crazy, and he started the process of nuclear disarmament, which manifested itself in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in December 1987, and the implementation of the treaty in June 1988. That is the treaty I was involved in. I was one of the first inspectors on the ground in the Soviet Union to get rid of these nuclear weapons. That shows how important and how dangerous Able Archer 83 was. We do the same today when a European leader asks NATO for a preemptive nuclear strike, and we use the corresponding means. This is a dangerous situation. It is reckless, and it is made worse by General Stoltenberg's statement. The NATO Secretary General has stood up and said, and you remember that NATO has denied that it has a role there, that it is not a party to this conflict, although it is supplying weapons. He said that a Russian victory in Ukraine would be a defeat for NATO, and that it was therefore imperative that NATO flex its muscles and carry out this exercise. So it is literally as if the children have taken over the kindergarten, the adults have fled and the children are in charge, and just ridiculous things are happening. That is what has happened to NATO. Where is the adult leadership? We are in a very dangerous time, not only in American history but also in world history, because there are allegations in both directions. There is talk of a Russian nuclear attack, although the Russians are not preparing for a nuclear attack. The Russians are concerned about a NATO overreaction, a concern now heightened by this nuclear exercise. One mistake, one misunderstanding could lead to an exchange of nuclear weapons that would end the world as we know it.
I don't think the human beings understand the gravity of the situation. You recently published an article in Consortium News about the nuclear doctrine of both Russia and the United States, in which you point out that the United States has a first strike capability in its doctrine. Can you talk about that?
One of the things that is being talked about right now, the big fear in the West, is that Russia is going to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, a tactical nuclear weapon. There is no Russian doctrine for the preemptive use of tactical nuclear weapons. And besides, to come back to the specific military operation, Russia will not nuclear attack Ukraine. Ukraine is a family. If Russia were to use a nuclear bomb, it would be against Europe, not against Ukraine, but it would never do so preemptively. Russia has two conditions under which it can use nuclear weapons. The first is if it is attacked with nuclear weapons, and then it will retaliate with everything it has. The second is if a conventional fighting capability comes together that threatens the survival of the Russian state, then Russia can use all the means at its disposal, including nuclear weapons, to eliminate that threat. But here we are told by so-called experts that Russia has a third doctrine, and they even admit that it is not in writing, so they say it is an unspoken doctrine. It says that Russia, when confronted with its impending defeat in Ukraine, will use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine to escalate the conflict and get the West, which is faced with the terrible reality of a nuclear conflict, to de-escalate. The only nation that has a strategy from escalation to de-escalation is the United States, and we have exercised it. We have built a nuclear weapon specifically for that purpose, the W-76-2 low-yield warhead, a warhead that is deployed on the Trident missile on the Ohio-class ballistic submarine. And in 2019, we actually conducted an exercise where the Secretary of Defense practiced at the headquarters of the United States Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska, issuing the release orders for the W-76-2 warhead in a scenario where Russian forces were advancing on the Baltics. So our goal was to escalate in order to get the Russians to de-escalate. We have this doctrine. We have practiced that doctrine. And now we are reflecting that doctrine on the Russians, but the Russians do not have that doctrine. So, again, when we talk about misperceptions based on ignorance, and when we think that the Russians have a strategy of escalation to de-escalation, and we respond to that with our own strategy of escalation to de-escalation, you can imagine that this can quickly lead to a misunderstanding and the use of nuclear weapons. If you use a nuclear weapon, the world ends. There is no such thing as limited nuclear war. There is no such thing. One nuclear weapon and the world ends. And here we have people in the United States and NATO who think they can use this one nuclear weapon to escalate, to de-escalate. But Russian doctrine clearly says if you hit us with a nuclear weapon, we let it all go. Putin has said, yes, that means we will be martyrs, but you will go to hell as perpetrators of global annihilation.
How do you think this will end? Is there any possibility that there could be peace negotiations? The U.S. and NATO seem to have done everything they can to thwart that. I feel that this is really a battle for the future of NATO, for the future of the U.S. and Western domination of the world and its resources.
Well, I think this will end with a Russian military victory in Ukraine. I think that is inevitable. I also think that one of the reasons why the Russians are timing this conflict the way they are is because they don't want to panic NATO and the United States into overreacting. For example, if NATO invades Western Ukraine and tries to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, then it creates a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. But if you bring about victory slowly, even if it means a huge cost to yourself, and gradually make NATO face the reality of defeat, then NATO will back down because it realizes that it has no other viable response, and that is what we are witnessing now. NATO has come out and said we don't want a conflict with Russia. We will continue to provide weapons to the Ukrainians, but we will not engage in a process that leads to NATO troops fighting with Russian troops in Ukraine. And I think that is a byproduct of the process that the Russians are using to fight this war. For all those out there who are pulling their hair out and saying, why doesn't Russia just win this thing quickly? The Russians are smarter than that. They are the only adults in the room, and they realize that a quick, decisive victory could create more problems than it solves. But Russia has to win this war from its point of view, because Russia's goal is not to destroy Ukraine. Russia's goal, as it has already stated, is a new European security framework. In December last year, Russia presented draft treaties to this effect. These do not talk about the end of NATO, but about NATO withdrawing from the Russian border and creating a kind of neutral zone in which the special interests of both Europe and Russia are respected. And that is the ultimate goal that Russia is pursuing here. I believe that Russia will not achieve this goal because NATO will wake up tomorrow and say, yes, we believe in it. NATO will not be around much longer. I mean, Europe is going to go through some very radical changes this winter. The European Union is falling apart as we speak. NATO is deeply fractured. The G7 is losing its raison d'etre. The G7 is supposed to be the 7 biggest economies in the world, but after this winter, will we really be able to call the German, Italian, French, and British economies the biggest economies in the world? The G7 is about to break up. NATO will not only face another embarrassment. Remember that only last year NATO was humiliated in Afghanistan. Now it will be humiliated by Ukraine and confronted with the fact that they have to spend trillions of euros that they don't have to do what the United States wants them to do, which is to continue to stand up to the Russians. Their economies are collapsing. European countries will realize that the way out of this problem is not to turn their backs on Russia, but to ask Russia to re-engage as an energy supplier. The United States is proving to be the most terrible friend imaginable. Friends don't blow up pipelines, but we do. When a friend is in need, they don't come and say, here is liquid natural gas, but you have to pay 10 to 15 times the market value because we are taking advantage of the situation to provide American companies with windfall profits. Friends don't behave like that. We do, and Europe will wake up and realize that the United States is not their friend. Now people are saying, wait a minute, where is Europe going to get the gas? Putin had a meeting with Turkish President Erdogan 2 days ago where he basically talked about creating a Turkish energy center. There is already a pipeline that delivers gas to southern Europe, the Turk Stream. It runs from Russia through the Black Sea to Turkey. Putin is talking about building the second pipeline and putting Turkey in the position that Germany would have been in if it had operated both pipelines, namely to become an energy hub meeting the strategic energy needs of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This will not only benefit the Turkish economy, but will also channel Russian gas back to Europe. And I guarantee you that Europe will be begging for this gas this spring, and Russia will deliver it. So there will be a new political reality in Europe that is perhaps more willing to listen to the Russians when they say we would like to talk about a new European security framework. And that will lead to the United States withdrawing from Europe and the whole world. The world is turning away from the United States. Look at what Saudi Arabia has just done together with Russia. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime guarantor of energy security, overdeveloped Saudi oil fields so that Saudi Arabia could increase or decrease production depending on the needs of the United States. Joe Biden crawled on his knees to Saudi Arabia in July and pleaded with Saudi Arabia to increase oil production by 1 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia waved it off and said we need to talk to the OPEC cartel plus first, and that plus is Russia, which means Saudi Arabia went to Russia to see if OPEC would be willing to help America. Well, the answer was not just no, but a resounding no. Russia and Saudi Arabia recently agreed to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day instead of increasing it. This will put Joe Biden in a very difficult position before the midterm elections, as prices at the pumps are now rising and heating oil is going up as America cools. So the United States is in trouble. The world is turning away from the dollar. The oil deals that used to be done in petrodollars are now being done in national currencies. The United States has lost the confidence of the world. How can you keep the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency when the United States, on a whim, seizes the sovereign wealth funds of nations that are in banks around the world? They seized $600 to $700 billion from the Russian sovereign wealth fund. How could anyone in the world trust the United States again? They can't. So it is not just that the United States has betrayed Europe. The United States has betrayed the world, and the world is beginning to realize that. That's why Putin and Chinese President Xi signed a 5,000-word joint statement when they met in Beijing on the 4th of February this year, essentially declaring the end of the U.S.-dominated rules-based international order. They said there would be a new multilateral order based on international law in which they would take the lead. And that is the direction in which the world is moving. If you are Americans, wake up. People, you are living in a historic moment. The decade we are in right now will be studied by historians, if we survive, and considered one of the critical points in modern history. We are witnessing the end of the American empire. The rules-based order that has dominated this globe since the end of World War II is at an end. It is being replaced by something else, and we are living in this transitional period. It will be a tough time for Americans. But every once in a while, you should just stop and understand what's happening, because we are literally living in one of the most important moments in modern history.
Alfred McCoy has also written about this, calling the 2020s the decade of the end of the U.S. empire. So what do you recommend to the human beings of the United States? Is there anything that human beings here can do to demand that there are adults in the room on our side as well? SR. Well, the most important thing is that the end of empire does not mean the end of life. America will still exist if we allow ourselves to exist. We will still have the same houses, still be able to drive the same road, still send our children to the same schools. We will just be a lesser nation in terms of the impact we have on the world. We have to learn to work responsibly with nations rather than dictate to them. And from the point of view of most Americans, hopefully we will live in a world where the American military is not this dominant force, so that maybe we don't have to spend $800 billion every year to build a military that defends an empire that is disintegrating. But the important thing here is that we don't decide to burn the planet down as the planet turns away from the American empire. We Americans must be mature enough to understand what is happening and why it is happening, and to direct it so that it does not lead to the death not only of America, but of the world. The end of the American empire does not mean the end of America. America can still exist as a prosperous nation-state that remains true to its ideals and values. It is time for the United States to start turning inwards and solving problems at home, rather than trying to dictate solutions to the world's problems abroad. To do that, we need to elect the right people to office. What is the most important thing Americans can do to preserve democracy in America? The answer is really simple. Almost everybody gives the same answer. You have to keep the money out of politics. If you take the money out of politics, if you repeal Citizens United, you can literally start filling the House of Representatives, the Senate, and even the White House with people who are not owned by special interests, people who are responsive to the American people. And that is what needs to happen. The solution to America's problems is a correctly implemented American democracy. So the human beings need to wake up, get involved, and do something to put the correct people in office. We need adults sitting at the levers of power when the critical decisions are made about how the world will turn away from the American empire. Adults who realize that this is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, that America can survive and thrive if we don't allow ourselves to overreact and decide to fight everyone as our empire crumbles. So the American people need to wake up, because otherwise we will be handing our future over to a political elite and an economic elite who will do anything to preserve what they have for as long as possible, even if that means in the end the destruction of everything they pretend to save. Thank you for all you are doing to be the voice of reason and educate the public about all this. This is a really critical time, and I think we need to have these discussions more and more about the role of the United States, about how things are shifting and how we need to move towards cooperative diplomacy rather than dominating the world militarily. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you for having me.